it's your favorite NPC, and today I'll teach you all the necessary CSS concepts without wasting your time. But why should you even learn CSS? HTML defines the structure of a web page, so where is a heading, a text, an image, and so on. But now, it's still ugly. By using CSS, you can add styles to the HTML elements, so colors, fonts, backgrounds, animations, pretty much anything you can imagine. So let's get started, guys. To get started using CSS, we first need a code editor. I'm going to use VS Code in this tutorial, but feel free to use anything. You just click the first link, download for Windows. We'll wait for this to finish and then you just press the setup. I accept the agreement, next, this is fine, next, install, and we'll wait for the installation to finish. Once done, let's press finish. VS Code is going to open and it will look like this. If it does not open, just type Visual Studio Code within your search bar, for example, and just open it right here. To really create a project, let's first of all go to the desktop, right click, let's create a new folder. The name is up to you. I'm going to say CSS course. And now I can go to Visual Studio Code and open a folder right here. I'm going to select my CSS course folder and I'm going to select the folder, and that will open Visual Studio Code within this folder. To use CSS, you will usually need an HTML file. So let's create an index.html file, like so. And let's create a basic template. And now, of course, we could go ahead and go to our folder, so CSS course, and just open the index file by pressing the index file, and this would open the website. But since I want live updates, we need a live server. So you're going to go to the extensions tab, go for live server, press this one and install the live server right here if it's not installed yet. And now we can open this index.html file with our live server, which will automatically update the preview page once we change anything within our index or CSS file. To use CSS, there now exist three ways, and the first one is going to be inline style. So let's first of all create a paragraph. To create inline styles, you can just use the style attribute for every single tag. And right here you can define styles like, for example, a background of yellow. And you don't need to understand this yet. Just remember that this will generate a yellow background for the given tag. And this here could have the text. And now you can see we're having this yellow background color. The second way is internal CSS. So let's just remove this. Let's save. And now we can, within our head, use the style tag. And within the style tag, we can now write CSS code. So we could, for example, target the paragraph and say background of yellow, for example. And again, you don't need to understand this right here. But whatever you write within the style tag will be interpreted as CSS. And now the last and the preferred method is using the link to link an external style sheet. So you first need to create an external style sheet, so a file that has the name style, for example, but that name is up to you. But you always need the .css ending to create a CSS file, like so. To include the CSS file within your document, you now have to use, within the head of your HTML document, the link tag. And it's actually easier to just type link within VS Code, and this will automatically create the link for you. And you can see we are having this rel right here that defines the relationship. And of course, this is a style sheet. So the relationship is style sheet and the href attribute. So right here, you need to define the path to your style sheet. In our case, it's style.css. And now this style sheet right here is linked to our HTML file. And now I could, for example, target all of the paragraphs and just say background of green, for example. And now we're having this green background right here. And usually you will use an external style sheet. So this way. Let's understand the selectors in CSS. So if you have an element like a paragraph, for example, or an H1 that says heading, then you can always select those elements by using the element selector. And the element selector goes as follows. You just use the name of the element. So for a paragraph, obviously P. For an H1, it would be H1. And for a div, it would be div, like so. And this will select all of the elements of that type on your page. So P will select all of the paragraphs on your page. Now I can say for every single P, I want to have a background of red or Rebecca purple, doesn't matter. And now I can see this paragraph has a background of Rebecca purple. And if I'm going to duplicate this one a couple of times, every single text will have the background of Rebecca purple. So the element selector selects every single element on your page. So background, yellow, and this will select all of the H1 elements. There also exists a class selector. So let me remove that. And the class selector works by first defining a class for your element. So I can say that this paragraph has a class of text, for example. And now I can target this class within CSS by saying dot followed by the name of the class, so dot text. And I could also say background is going to be red. Now this one has a red background, and I can use a class as often as I want. So I can also say that the third paragraph should have a class of text. And maybe even this h1 right here should have a class of text. So I can reuse a class over and over again, and different elements can of course also have the same class. If I want to create something that is unique, then I can use the ID, and every single ID should be unique. So if I'm going to create the ID heading, for example, then I should only use it once on my page. So something like this right here is actually not valid, and something that you definitely want to avoid. So if you want to use an ID for the paragraph as well, then you need a different ID name. So maybe text is fine, but heading is not fine because we already have an ID of heading. Now I can target the ID by saying hashtag, which targets an ID, followed by the ID name, heading in our case. Now I can say for the background, I want to use green, for example. And now we have a green background. There also exists the universal selector. So I can use this one right here. And now you could, for example, say background of yellow. And now you can see everything is just yellow. So the universal selector just means select everything. So select the entire document essentially. And those ones are the most important ones. And actually you will use those ones 95% of the time. If you remember them, that's pretty good already. But now let me show you some selectors that you might want to use from time to time. Imagine we're having a div right here, and inside of this div we have maybe a paragraph and another paragraph. And now I want to select all of the paragraphs that sit within a div. So all of the children, as you call them, within a div. So this div right here is the parent element. That's what you say within CSS. And everything that is within this div is a child of this div. So I want to select every single paragraph within a div. So I'm going to go into the div and select the paragraph. That's what the syntax says. And now I can say I want to have a background of yellow. And you can see only the paragraphs within a div will now have the background of yellow. Now let me also create a second div in here, and let me also create another paragraph that has a little bit of text. And you can see this one will also have a yellow text or yellow background. If I'm now going to use this symbol though, I'm saying only take the direct child of a div, and actually this here is obviously a direct child of a div, so I need to say that this here is going to be a span, for example, like this. And now you can see that this here will not have a yellow background anymore, because now it's a direct child of a span, but it's not a direct child of a div anymore. Only those two paragraphs are a direct child of a div. So only those two paragraphs will have a yellow background. If you want to select a neighbor, for example, then you can do it as follows. So let's say div, and right below this div we have a paragraph that has a little bit of text, and now this paragraph is a direct neighbor to this div. So I could, for example, say div plus p. So the neighbor, the paragraph neighbor of the div, could have a background of red. And now you can see we're having a red background for our paragraph, because this paragraph is a neighbor, a direct neighbor to our div. If I'm going to duplicate that one though, you can see that the second one will not have a red background because it's not a direct neighbor of our div anymore. If I wanted to get every single sibling, so every neighbor essentially, then I can use this tilde symbol. And now you can see we're selecting all of the siblings. You could also create an anchor tag, for example, and say that href is going to be www.google.com. And actually this doesn't really matter too much, but let's just use it for now. And another anchor tag that just doesn't say anything. And this here goes to Google, this goes to Google, whatever, doesn't matter. And now I could select every anchor tag that has an href of www.google.com. And I can do as follows. So I'm going to select anchor tags of href being equal to whatever we have right here. And now I'm going to say that one has a background of red. And now, as you can see, the first anchor tag has a background, a red background, because that one is an anchor tag that includes an href of www.google.com. And every other anchor tag who does not meet this criteria will not be selected. But actually, you'll barely ever use it. So now you've seen it, and actually that's enough. So let's delete this. Let's delete this right here, and let's create a basic paragraph that has 5 words of text, for example. Let's understand how we can style the background. So I've already shown you that you can create a background style, so a background color, by using background. And of course, you can just define the name of the background. So you could just say red, and this would work, but obviously this gives you very little flexibility because you're bound to predefined names. Now you can also, in VS Code, go over this color and just use the color picker to select RGB. So you can also use RGB values to define a certain color. And RGB stands for red, green, blue. So you mix basically red, green, and blue to create a color, because all of the colors are made up of red, green, and blue. You can also just go to Google Color Picker, for example, and right here you will be able to select a color, for example. So you can just pick any color within this window. And now you could, for example, just copy the RGB value. So you can just press copy. And now you could, for the background, just paste this in here. And now we're having this green color for the background. So this right here would work. And you can see that we're also getting the hex code right here. So you can also just use a hex code. So this represents the color using hexadecimal numbers. And you don't need to understand how this works for now. It's just another form of representation of colors. So I can also use the hex code right here, and the result would be the exact same. I can also use, instead of using RGB, I can also use RGBA, which stands for red, green, blue, and alpha. So I can also define transparency. So I could, for example, say 255, 255, 120, and 0.4, for example. And as you can see, I'm just having a pretty transparent form of red. And if I'm going to use 0.1, it's almost fully transparent, and 0.0, it's completely transparent. And of course, those guidelines do not only work for backgrounds, but they work for any color that you will define within CSS. So if you want to define a text color, for example, you can do the exact same. To define the text color, you use the color property followed by the name of the color or the hex code or the RGB value. So you could say black, for example, save that one, and now you will have a black text, which is normal. You could say red, now you have red text. You can use RGB, 100, 100, 100. Now you will have the RGB value. You can use RGBA, 0.2. Now you will have a pretty transparent color. And of course, you can also use the hex code. Let me also show you how to use a background image. So let's just search for Unsplash, for example, and get an image from Unsplash. You can get pretty much any image, but I'm going to use those ones since they are free. I'm going to download that one. I'll drag that in here. Name is going to be Mario. I don't even know why, but let's say Mario. And now I can use, instead of background, I can also use background minus image if I want to be precise, but I can also just use background. So background works for background images and background colors. Background image, so background minus image only works for a background image. Background minus color only works for the background color. But you can just use background and then it will work either way. So now you have to define a URL right here. And inside of this URL method, you have to define the path to our image. And in our case, it's mario.jpg. Let's go to our page and you can see that we're getting this background image behind the paragraph. And of course, the more text I have, so lorem 100, the more content, and of course, the higher the background. Now let's delete this one and let's understand how to style fonts. So right now we're having this paragraph. And of course you can define a background by using background. You can define the color of the text by using the color. You can define a font size. So how big is this font by using font minus size. And now you can, for example, say 20 pixels like so. And we're going to use pixels for now, but there are a lot of different units and we'll understand them later on. You can also define a font family. So something like Times Roman is a font family. And the font family just defines the style of the font. And in our case, we can just use Times Roman, for example, and I think this is the default anyways, but we can also use a different font. So we could also say, give me system UI. And now you can see we have a different font. Now there exist a couple of predefined font families that are usually installed on every single system. And you can use all of those fonts here by default. But if you want to use a different font that is not usually installed on every single system, then you first need to import this font within your project, and we can do that. So let's, for example, go to Google Fonts. Right here, you can browse fonts on the page. Let's go to full screen, and let's say we want to use Roboto, for example. Then we are just going to press Roboto. We want to get the font. We want get embed code, and now you have to copy those ones right here. So this input code, and you can see we have to embed this code within the head of your HTML file. So let's go to HTML. And right before our link text, or right before our style sheet, we need to load the fonts. So I paste them in here. And now we can just go to the page again. And we can just copy this line that defines font family, Roboto, sans serif. And instead of our font family at the moment, we can just paste that in here. And once I'm going to save the file, you can see we're having a different font right now. So we're having Roboto right now. We can also use something like text decoration of underline, for example. We can also use line through and so on. But most of the time you will use text decoration of none. Why will you use that? Let me show you. If you have an anchor tag, for example, then you see that we're having, for Google, then you see that we're having this underline. And if I now want to get rid of this underline, then I'm going to target our anchor tag and say text decoration of none. And you can see the underline is now gone. And that is a pretty common use case. To change the font weight, you can also use font minus weight, followed by a number, so 100, 200, up to 900, I think, or followed by a name. So bold, normal, and so on. So all of this works. You can also use bolder, lighter, whatever. And actually 600 is equal to bold, 400 is equal to normal. So if I'm just going to use 400, this will still be normal. If I'm going to use 600, we will have a bold font, as you can see. We can also use text align, and of course we can use left, right, and most of the time you will probably use center, and this will center align your font. You can change the line height by using line minus height, and now I could say I want to have line height of 2, for example, or 4, or maybe 1. So this defines the spacing between the lines. And now, as previously mentioned, you can use a font size of 20 pixels, for example. So you can use absolute values like pixels. So your computer screen is made out of pixels. So if you have a resolution of 1080p, you have, for example, 1920 pixels on the horizontal axis and 1080 pixels on the vertical axis. So whatever you are seeing on the screen is just made out of individual small pixels, and every single pixel has its own unique color. And even though it looks like a normal image to you, in the end, under the hood, you just use so many pixels that your eye cannot really recognize that the finished image is just made out of individual pixels, because you just have so many of them. And now we can, of course, define our font size by using those pixels, which is an absolute unit, because 40 pixels are always 40 pixels. So you can do that, but you can also do something like REM, for example. So 1 REM, and this will say that the font size takes up 1 time the font size of the root element. And the root element is this HTML tag, because of course this is the root of our entire document. Everything else is within this root tag, so within this HTML tag. And if we use rem, then this takes up 1 time the font size of the root element. So if we define a different font size for our root element by saying :root, which will tag our root element, and we say font size is going to be 40 pixels, you can see now this text right here takes up 1 rem, so 1 time the font size of the root element. If I'm now going to say 2 rem, this will be 80 pixels, because this will take up twice the font size of the root element. And of course, 3 will take up 120 pixels. Now you can also use em instead of rem, and this will inherit the font size from the parent element. So if I'm going to put this paragraph inside of a div, for example, and now I'm going to say for every single div, I want to have a font size of only 10 pixels, then you can see now this here becomes pretty small. Now this only has a font size of 30 pixels, because the parent element, or the closest parent where we've defined a font size, only has a font size of 10 pixels. If I'm going to use rem instead, you can see that we are still having the super big font. So this is the difference. If you use rem, it inherits the font size of the root element. If you use em, it inherits the font size of the closest parent element. Let's now just delete all of this, and let's define a width and a height for a div. So you can also manually define a width and a height for a div, for example, so for a container, and say this here should have a height of 100 pixels and or a width of 100 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Now let's also use a background of yellow so we can see this div. And now we can also use, for things like containers, for example, different units. So we could, for example, say take up a width of 100% of the viewport width, and now it takes up all of the available width the viewport provides. And the viewport obviously depends on your device, so you have a different viewport if you're on a desktop device than on a mobile device, for example. So this depends on the available width, and now you can of course also use 100 viewport height, and this depends on the height of your viewport. And 100 viewport height just means take up 100% of the viewport height, so 1 time the viewport height. And now we've defined the viewport height for this div, but now let's also say that we're within this div having another div, for example. And let's say the first div has a class of 1 and the second one has a class of 2. Now we could say that the first div, so .1, should take up all of the available space, and .2 will also have a background of red, for example, a height of maybe 100 pixels, but now for the width, I'm going to say it should only take up 30% of the available width. And now this here is going to take up 30% of the width available from the parent element. So from the first parent who restricts the width, for example. And since 1 has a width of 100 viewport width, 2 is going to take up 30% of that space. So you can use percent to define a percentage of the available space. So for things like text, you usually want to use pixels, M or rem. And for things like container, you usually want to use viewport width, viewport height, and percentages. Now let's delete everything, and let's also delete everything within our index.html, and let's only create one single div. And for this div, let's say that the div has a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels and a background of Rebecca purple, for example. And actually 100 pixels. So now we're having this square. How can we now create distance to the left, top, bottom, or right, for example? And in order to do so, we can use something like margin top, for example. And now we can define a margin top of 40 pixels, which will create a margin between the element and the next element. And the next element in our case is the top of the page. So between top and this element. If we're now going to create a second div, for example, you will see that we will have this margin top for every single div. Now, of course, we can also say we want to have a margin left. Now we have a margin left, a margin right. Now we have a margin right or a margin bottom, which will add a margin bottom to both of those div elements. Now there's also the shorthand property for margin. So you can just use margin. And now the first value is the top value. So we could say margin top 40 pixels. Second value is the right value, so 20 pixels. Let's maybe add 0 pixels to the bottom and 100 pixels to the left. And now you can see we're getting this effect. So this is what this looks like. Top, right, bottom, left. So top, right, bottom, left. And if you only define two values, so for example 80 pixels and 40 pixels, then 80 pixels defines margin top and bottom, and 40 pixels defines margin left and right. So let me save this. And you can see 80 pixels top and bottom, 40 pixels left and right. Now you can also use something called padding. So you could also say padding top and say 40 pixels. But you see this is actually pretty weird. So this seems to stretch our box. So now our box seems to be a little bit longer. So let me delete one of those divs so we can really see what is going on. And if I'm now going to add a padding right, for example, of 40 pixels, you can see that our box is getting a little bit wider as well. So is this actually just width? And actually, of course, the answer is no. Let me remove the background for you. And let me create something that is called a border in CSS. So you can use a border to create a border. First value defines the border width of 1 pixel, for example. Second one defines the style of the border. So you can, for example, say solid, dotted. So let's use dotted. And the third value is the color. So let's use a black border. So now you can see we have a dotted black border. But let me use solid. So we have a normal border. And now let me also, within this div, have a paragraph, for example, that is just one word. So this word. And now I'm going to use a padding left of 40 pixels. And you can see we're getting this effect. So somehow the text seems to get pushed away from the left. So from the border in this case. And if I'm now going to use margin minus left 40 pixels, you can see that it seems to push our entire box to the side. So how does this work? And we can understand how this works by just inspecting this element. Now we can go or scroll a little bit to the bottom, and then we get this box model. And this here is called box model within CSS. So this right here defines the width and the height of the content. In our case, 100 pixels times 100 pixels, because that was our width and our height. The second value defines the padding. Since we've defined padding of 40 pixels to the left, you will see that we have the padding right here. And after the padding, you can see that we're getting the border. So padding is between content and border. And after the border, we have the margin. So margin is outside of the border. So if you want to create space between border and content, then you have to use padding. And if you want to create space between the elements, then you have to use the margin. And that is really important to understand. And you can see by default, if I'm going to use something like, so let me minimize the page, and now I'm going to use a background of yellow again. And as you've already seen, if I'm going to use padding of 40 pixels, for example, this will increase the size of our box. But now there exists something that is called box sizing. And this defines how our boxes, so how our content will be resized when we use padding, for example. And usually on every single page, you want to use something called border box. So when using height and width, you do not define the width and the height of the content, but in fact you define, let me show you, the width and the height of everything up to the border. So everything including the border. So that is the border box. So if I say 100 pixels, this means content plus padding plus border will have a width of 100 pixels. So if I'm going to add a little bit of padding, for example, of 40 pixels, for example, then automatically our content will be a little bit smaller and we will have a little more padding. So let me save this one and you will see that now our box is a lot smaller right here. And usually if you work with CSS, you do something like this. So you use the universal selector and say box sizing of border box. So this defines that for the entire document, you want to use border box. And this is important because otherwise your width and your height can really cause unexpected behavior if used together with padding and borders and so on. And of course, if you say you want to have a height of 100 pixels, for example, most of the time you want all of the content to take up 100 pixels. So that is why you usually define border box by using the universal selector. And let me for the div again say width 100 pixels, height 100 pixels, background yellow. And if you take a look at that one, you also see that we have a little bit of spacing to the top and to the left. And the reason for this is that HTML will by default add a little bit of padding and margin to a couple of elements, to the document and so on. And again, we can fix it by using the universal selector and saying for the entire document, by default, we want to have a margin of 0 and padding of 0. And as you can see now, this has been fixed. So again, to sum up, you can use margin of top, right, bottom, left to define a margin outside of the border of an element. And you can use padding of top, right, bottom, left to define padding between content and the border. And you can of course also use padding or margin top, bottom, left, and right. Let's now understand position in CSS. Let's first of all create a div. And this div has the ID container, like so. And now I'm going to create another div that has the ID 1. And by using this syntax, so div followed by a hashtag followed by the ID, you're going to create a div that has the ID 1. And now I can also create a div that has the ID 2 by using this syntax right here. So now I'm having those divs. And for the hashtag container div, so for the parent container, I want to have a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. I want to have a background of black. And now I'm going to say hashtag 1 will have a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, a background of yellow. And I'm going to do the exact same for hashtag 2, but I'll use red as a color, like this. And actually this here is hashtag 2, like this. And now we can use position absolute, like so, for an element, for example. So for hashtag 1. And by using position absolute, you will enable top, left, right, and bottom, which allows you to create spacing from the top, left, right, and bottom. So I could, for example, say top 0 pixels, and you can see that we're getting this element to top of 0 pixels, and I could say left 100 pixels, for example, then we're pushing it away by 100 pixels from the left. And of course, I could also say bottom 0 pixels, and now we're right here at the bottom. So what is the reference point for an element that you position absolute? The reference point is always the first element in the hierarchy that has another position, for example. And in our case, you can see we did not define any kind of position for any of our elements on the page. So for any of the parent elements, and we only have the container as a parent element for 1 and 2 and the body. And now hashtag 1, which has position of absolute, will take a look at the entire document. Okay, which of those elements, which of those parents has a position? Container does not have a position yet, so that one is not our reference point. if none of the parents have a position, then it's always going to use the body, so the HTML document, as a reference point. And therefore, it will position this element absolute to the page. So if you use bottom of 0, for example, then the document is going to be the reference point, and we will have 0 pixels of spacing to the bottom and 100 pixels spacing to the left. If I'm now going to set position relative for the container though, you can see that now the reference point is going to be the container, because that is the next element in our hierarchy that has a position. So the container is the parent of #1, so of the div with an ID of 1. So that is the parent. And now position absolute refers to the parent element, to the first parent element that has a position. And usually you use position absolute combined with position relative. So that is something that is really common. And now I could of course also say for #2 position absolute left 0, for example, and top 50 pixels. So now we're getting this effect right here. Now you could also use something like position fixed, for example. And now let's use top of 0, for example. And again, we take the document as a reference point in this case, if we're using position fixed. But now let me say that the entire body, so the entire document, has a min height of 200 viewport height. So this is a super high document, and now we can essentially scroll. And as you can see, position fixed means that this element will always stay in a fixed position. And this is pretty common if you think about a navbar, for example. Then the navbar is fixed, and even though you scroll down, you will always see the navbar on top of your page. And you could do that by using position fixed, for example. Let's understand the Flexbox in CSS. Imagine we're having a div that has the ID 1, for example, right here, another div and another div. And the second div has the ID 2, and the third div has the ID 3. Now we'll also have a wrapping container for all of those divs. And this div could, for example, have the ID container, like so. And inside of this div, we are now having our 3 items. Let's say for #1, so container 1, we will have a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a background of yellow, for example. We're going to save this one, and then we'll just duplicate those styles right here for our second and our third container. So #2, #3, and this one will be red, and this one will be Rebecca purple. Now we're having those 3 divs right here, but maybe we want those divs to sit next to each other. And in order to do that, we can use a Flexbox. So #container. And usually you use the Flexbox on a parent element to align the children within this parent element. So by saying that #container will have a display of flex, we will now say that the children will only take up the minimal necessary space and align next to each other. You can also define the flex direction. The flex direction defines into which direction the items will be aligned, so the children will be aligned, and it can either be row or column. And row is the default behavior, and column defines keep the items in a column. The benefit of using a Flexbox, even if you want to have the children within a column, is that you can now define a gap between those items, for example. So you could say have a gap of 20 pixels between those items, and this would easily align them properly. You can also say that you want to justify the content, and you can, for example, say justify the content within the center. And if you now say height is 100 viewport height, this container has a height of 100 viewport height and will align all of the items in the center, like so. Now let's also go back to the flex direction of row, and you will see now justify content refers to the row. And the reason for this is that justify content always aligns the items along the main axis. If flex direction is row, then the main axis is the row. Therefore, justify content aligns the items on the main axis, which is the row in this case. If we're now going to say flex direction of column, now the column is our main axis, and therefore justify content will refer to the column and therefore align the items on the vertical axis. Let's go back to row, and in order to align the items on the secondary axis, you can use align minus items. And you can use center right here as well. And since our main axis is the row right now, justify content refers to the row and align items refers to the columns, so essentially to the vertical axis. Instead of using center for justify content, you can also use something called space between, for example. And let me get rid of the gap. So you can see we're still getting the same result. You can also use something called space around, which will create space around the items. You can also say flex start, for example, which will align the items at the start, or you can use flex end, which will align the items at the end. And the same, of course, goes for align items. You can also use flex start, for example, like so, or flex end, which will arrange the items on the secondary axis, which in this case is the column because our primary axis is the row. As you can see, at the moment our items take up a certain width and a certain height, but maybe we want our items to grow if there is space available and to shrink if there's no space available. So we could, for example, say for item number 1, so the yellow one, that we want to have flex grow of 1, which means grow if there is space available. And as you can see now, the yellow container grows if there is space available. By default, those items have flex grow 0, so they will always keep their width and height. If hashtag 1 now would have a width of 300 pixels, for example, you can see that our other items are shrinking. But we could also say that flex shrink, which is by default 1, is now going to have a value of 0, which means don't shrink. So let's use a width of 200 pixels for that one as well. And now you can see actually both of those items take up a little bit too much space and there's not enough space available. In that case, we can also say for our Flexbox, if there's no space available, we want to wrap into a new line, and we can do so by saying flex wrap, and we can set it to wrap. And as you can see now, our items wrap into a new line if there's no space available. Let's go back to a width of 50 pixels for every single item. So 1, 2, and 3, like so. And let me remove 50 pixels, and let me also remove flex wrap for now. And I want to show you something about flex grow. So if we are going to define flex grow of 1 right here, for the yellow one, for example, and I'm now going to define flex grow of 2 for hashtag 2, for example, you can see that the second container is growing at a higher rate than the first container. So that is important to remember. You can always define the portion of growth an item should take up by increasing the flex grow value. So let me remove all those flex related properties and let's go to a grid now. Because that is pretty similar to the Flexbox, but allows you to visualize your entire page as a grid, for example. So you also have rows and columns. But now you rather have to imagine this as a raster rather than just aligning the items next to each other if there's space available. We can define a grid by saying display grid instead of display flex, for example. So now we have a grid, but we also need to define how many columns and how many rows we want to have. And we can do so by saying grid template columns, for example. Right here we can define how many columns we want to have, and we could, for example, say the first column should have a width of 100 pixels and the second one should have a width of 150 pixels, for example. So now we have one column right here that takes up 100 pixels and the second column that takes up 150 pixels. I'm now going to say for a width of container hashtag 3, for example, take up 100% of the available space. You will see that this is the result. And let me do the exact same for the other one, so you really see how big a cell is and how the grid looks under the hood. So you can see column number 1, 100 pixels, column number 3, 150 pixels. Let me now do the exact same for the height, so 100%, 100%, and 100%. And you can see this right here looks pretty weird now because we did not define the rows yet. So we need to say grid, template, rows. And let's say the first row should have a height of 100 pixels and the second one should have a height of 50 pixels. And this is something that you use pretty often for photos, for example. Instead of pixels, you can also define fractions. So take up one fraction of the available space and take up 3 fractions of the available space, for example. You can also say that you want to repeat something for a certain amount of time. So repeat, I want to have 2 columns and every single column should have 150 pixels of width, for example. But our window at the moment is actually not having 300 pixels of width, so now this should work. And of course you can do the exact same for our rows, so you could say repeat 3 times 100 pixels, for example. For the grid you can of course also define a gap, so I could say 20 pixels of gap between the columns and the rows. And those are the most common properties that you will need when using a grid. And again, a grid is especially important if you think about a photo gallery, for example. Let's delete this and let's take a look at pseudo-classes. Imagine we're having a button right here and this button says click me, for example. Now we want to style this button within CSS, so let's target our button. Let's say the background is by default, for example, yellow and we have a text that is black. like this. So it looks absolutely terrible. But now, as you can see, if we hover over this button, there's not really a difference. And oftentimes when you have a page, you see a difference, and you can create this difference by using button:hover. So you always use a pseudo class by using a colon followed by the pseudo selector, essentially, right after the selector. So once we hover over this button, we maybe want to have a background of red. And now once I hover over this button, you can see that the background turns red. And I can also define a transition. So I can say transition. Which kind of property do I want to transition on? Let's define our background. What is the time? 0.5 seconds, for example. And let me show you. And now you can see we have a smooth transition between those properties. And I can also define a timing function. So ease in, out, ease out, and so on. So a timing function describes how the animation is played. So ease, for example, means start slow, get faster, and end slow. And now, of course, you can also say that you just want to animate all properties. So if you would have something like color of white, then this would have a transform as well now. Now you could also say that you want to use :active, which means when the element is active. So once I click this button and press it, so once I'm holding it, this element is active. And now we're applying this pseudo class right here. Let's create an input element right here of type text, for example. And now you can see once I click into this input feed, we're having this outline right here. So the thick outline. And this is the default behavior that comes with HTML and CSS. In order to change this focus, we can just use input:focus. And we can, for example, define that we do not want to have an outline anymore, but instead we want to have a background of yellow. And once we now click into this input feed, you can see we're getting this weird background color and our outline is now gone. Let's create a new anchor tag that redirects the user to Instagram, for example. We're going to search for Instagram. I copy that link right here. I paste it in here. And now let's go to our page. And you can see we're having this normal style right here. But now, once we've visited this link, so once we've clicked this link at least once, I want to have a color of brown, for example. So let me choose brown right here. And you can see now we're having this brown color because we've already visited this link. If I'm now going to use a new anchor tag that redirects us to www.cat.com, for example, and this is the cat page, you can see that this has a normal blue color. If I'm now going to say target underline blank to open this in a new page, and now I click this link, the page does not seem to exist. Let me actually get a normal page. I'm going to copy the link address right here. I'll paste it in here, so this one should now exist. We're going to go to our page. I'm going to open that link. That opens Wikipedia, and you can see now our background. And you can see now the link has a brown color because now we've visited this link. So visited styles a link that has been visited already. Now let's create an unordered list. And instead of this unordered list, we are having a list item. This is item 1, 2, and 3, like this. And now I only want to select the first item within this unordered list. So the first child, essentially, within this unordered list. So I can say that I want to select every li element that is the first child, so colon first child, and every list element that is the first child will have a background of brown. And right here, only the first list element now has a background color of brown. We can also say last child, and now only the last child will have a background color of brown, but we can also use nth child. And now we can define odd, for example. Now all of the odd element numbers will have a background of brown, or we can use even. And now the even elements will have a color of brown. We can also use something called n. So n just means take every single element, 2n, every second element, 3n, every third element, and so on. So I think you get the idea. Imagine we are having a checkbox right now, so input of type checkbox. And now we want to style this checkbox once it has been checked. So input, colon check. So once the checkbox has been checked, then we should first remove the default appearance by saying appearance none. And now we can say we want to have a width of 50 pixels, height of 50 pixels, and maybe a background of brown. So that would be an example. Now once I'm going to check the checkbox, you can see that we're now getting this style right here. Once I'm going to uncheck the checkbox, we're having the default style again. So input colon checked defines the styles for an input field that has been checked. Now that we've covered pseudo-classes, let's also cover pseudo-elements. We're going to remove this input field, and we're just going to have a normal paragraph that has 3 words of text, for example. And now I want to select our paragraph, colon, after, for example. And now I can define some content, for example. This could be a little bit of text. And this has been added after. And you can see now we've added after this element a little bit of text. Of course, you can also keep the content empty, define a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background of yellow, for example. You also need to say display block, and we'll get to that later, but now you've added this block level element after the paragraph. And of course, you can also use before, and this is the exact same. The only difference is that you'll add this element before. So let's understand block, inline block, and inline right now. As you might know, a div is a block level element, whereas a span is an inline element. So if I'm now going to add 2 spans, I'm going to say text 1, and this here is text 2. You can see that those texts will be displayed in line, so they only take up the necessary space. This is completely different for a div, for example, because a div always takes up an entire row. So by default, this span is an inline element and this div is a block level element. I can now turn our span into a block level element by saying display of block, for example. And you can see now it behaves like a block level element. I can also say that our div should have a display of inline, and now this behaves like an inline element. What is the difference? The only difference really is that for a block level element, you can define a width and a height, whereas you cannot do so for a span element. So let me remove this because it's confusing. And the span by default is an inline element. So if I'm now going to say I want to have a background of brown, you can see our spans have a background color of brown. But if I define a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, this will not change anything because I cannot define width and height for an inline element. If I'm now going to do the exact same for our div though, you will see that we will have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. Because this is a block level element. If I'm now going to say display block, for example, you can see that width and height works for all of those elements, but now those elements lose their inline style, so they are not being inline anymore. And the solution for this is that I can also say inline block. So you get the benefits from a block level element and the benefits from an inline element. And now those elements are still inline, but you can basically set width and height. Let's understand media queries, for example, now. So we're going to delete all of this and we're just going to have one div. We're going to target this div. So this div will have by default a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels and a background of brown. And you can see this looks completely fine if I have a big browser. But once I get to a pretty small window size, you can see that this looks pretty weird because we actually just do not have the space for this entire square. So we can define that once we get to a certain width, we want to change, for example, the width of an element or the height of an element, the font size, whatever. A media query just allows you to define different styles for different devices by defining different breaking points. Let me show you. You always start by saying add media, and now you can define the type. If you are coding for the web or a mobile device and so on, you most likely will have a screen, but you could also define a media query for print, for example. So add media, screen, and now you can define a width, so a max width, a min width, and so on. And in our case, and max width of maybe 700 pixels. So once we get below 700 pixels, we want to have for our div a width of only 50 pixels and a height of only 50 pixels. And you can see once we get to a width below 700 pixels, we're having a super small div. But once I'm going to increase the size of this one, of this window, and once we get to a width above 700 pixels, we will have the super big square right now. And a media query is super important because you also want to optimize for mobile devices, because a lot of users nowadays use mobile devices, obviously. And now you could, for example, say I want to define a media query for a max width of 700 pixels, but maybe also for 400 pixels. And right here, it maybe has 50 pixels of width, 100 pixels of width, and so on. And now we're going to scale it up like so. We're going to go to 100 pixels And that's essentially it. So you can see this is what this looks like. We are now having different breakpoints for different devices. And now I could, for example, try to optimize your page for a mobile device, for a tablet, and a desktop device. Let's understand animations. So we're just going to keep this one div that now has a width of 50 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. And now we can, for example, animate this div right here. We can create an animation by saying add keyframes, followed by the identifier, which is the name of our animation. We can just say this is a cool animation, but of course you can also use a more descriptive name, followed by opening and closing brackets. And now you can define from, and you can define to. From defines the initial position, so we can say from background of yellow, for example, and we want to go from a background of yellow to a background of brown. To now define that we want to use this animation, we can use the animation property. We can define a name. The name is cool animation because that was the identifier that we've defined right here. Duration, maybe 4 seconds for this entire animation. And timing function can be linear, for example, so play this animation at a constant speed. Ease, so start slow, get faster, and slow. You also have ease in, ease out, and so on. But I'm going to use linear in this case. I do not want to have a delay, so I'm going to remove that one. Iteration count can be pretty much anything, but you can of course also just use infinite, for example. So just loop this animation forever. Direction can be normal, it can be reverse, and so on. Actually, you will not really need this because if you really want to have a reverse animation, why wouldn't you just define it like that from the beginning? So I don't really see too much of a point in it. And we will get to fill mode in a second, but we're not going to need this one for now. And now once I'm going to save this one, you can see that we are playing this animation right here. And it will loop forever and ever and ever. Now let's also remove infinite, so we'll only play this animation once. And you can see we're playing this animation and we're stopping at the last frame right here, so at brown. Those were the most important properties that you really use when using animations. Let's remove this animation for now and let me introduce you to the transform property. So I can use transform right here, and this allows you to transform something. And you have different transformations. You have something like scale, for example, 1.1, which means scale is up by 10%. And as you can see now, this is a little bit bigger, 1.5, this is a lot bigger. I can also use rotate, for example, maybe 45 degrees. So now we have a slight rotation. If I want to translate into a certain direction, I can use translate X, for example, to translate into the X direction by maybe 100 pixels. So now we translated that one by 100 pixels to the right. And you will see that the result is completely different if I'm going to translate first and rotate afterwards. Because now I'm first going to translate into the X direction and then I'm going to rotate. So it will be here. If I'm first going to rotate and then translate into the X direction, of course the X direction is now also rotated and therefore it will go into this direction. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. I can also use translate Y to translate into the Y direction, so maybe 200 pixels. And those ones are actually the most important ones. And those ones are also pretty cool if you work with an animation. So we could just create a new animation. So add keyframes, identifier, cool, animate. We're going to start from, and let's say we are going to start with a transform of scale of 1, so a normal transform. And then we're going to transform of scale of 1.5, for example. And now for our animation, we can say we want to use cool animate 2 seconds, linear, and we want to do this forever, so infinite. I'm just going to remove the other two. And you can see now we're getting this scaling for the square right here. And let me also show you something that is a little bit cooler when working with animations. Now we're always using from to, but you can also define percentages. So I can say this here is going to be 0%, this here is going to be 50%, and now I'm just going to copy that one and say this here is going to be 100%. So it will stop wherever it started. So now this here is 1.1 maybe, and we're having this small scale up effect. And let's say we only have 1 second. And now of course you could also say, okay, background yellow, background brown, and again background yellow for the last one. So we're always starting where we finished. So we have a seamless loop. Let me also introduce you to a super important concept that is called variables. by saying :root, we target the root element. The root element is usually this HTML element, because this is the root of the entire document, because everything is within this HTML tag. And within :root, we can now usually define our variables. We define a variable by saying -- for example, and now we can define a variable name. So primary minus color, for example, could be a variable name, and this could be just yellow. Of course, you could also say this is RGBA of 0.4, for example. So let me create a primary color -- secondary minus color. This can be red, for example. The variable names are up to you. This could also be -- Goku, and now he has 100 pixels, for example. Doesn't matter, that's up to you. And now we can just use those variables. Let's take a look. We have this div right here. Now I could say for this div, which will have a width of 50 pixels and a height of 50 pixels, that one is going to have a background of var -- primary color, for example. So now we've used primary color right here, and we can also use secondary color, for example. And now we've used the secondary color, which is red. And now you might wonder, what is the benefit of this? And now if we are going to have a lot of different things on our page, for example, we are also going to have a button right here, and that button is also going to use as a background our variable primary color, for example. Or let's use secondary in this case. Let's give this button a text like click me. And now I decided that I want to use a different primary color, for example, or a different secondary color for our web page. Without a variable, I would have to go in there and change that. So I would have to replace red right here. I would have to replace red right here, and so on. But now with a variable, I only have to go right here. Maybe I change it to yellow. And that's essentially it. It's as easy as that to change all of the colors on our entire web page by using a variable, for example. And now for the font size, for example, I could also say var -- Goku. And now I have a super big font size. And maybe I think, okay, maybe this was a little bit too much. Maybe Goku should only have a font size of 20 pixels. So now I only have to change that within one single place, and the entire page will be updated. And this is also great for things like border radius, border width, and so on. So all kinds of things that should be standardized on your web page. From time to time, you might want to have information for yourself or other developers on your web page, and you can use a comment to do so. A comment you start by using a slash, asterisk, slash. And within the asterisk, you can now write a comment. So this is only for me. You can save this, and now this is code that will not be executed. So this is only for you and other developers to, for example, describe what you've done, to give additional information, and so on. If you ever want to remember something, for example, then you can use a comment.